Hello. So this is just a guide on how to use the psychology equipment, and also what psychology equipment is available for use in your dissertation. So most of you may be thinking that you're doing questionnaires, but you'll find that this is also relevant for you, as well as the people using kind of the more typical equipment that people would think of. But before we start, I should give a warning. I do not mark your dissertation, and therefore I cannot advise you on what you should do. I merely suggest ways something could be done. You should always check with your dissertation tutor before going ahead with something that I suggest you could do. So it's important to remember that your dissertation tutor should have the overall control. Okay, so questionnaires. The graduate assistant keeps all the questionnaires, that's me, and also including the scoring keys. You'll find a list of questionnaires available in your student handbook, but it's important to remember that if there isn't a questionnaire in the handbook, I can often locate it for you. So don't think that just because one isn't available that you can't have access to it. I also, if you're using a visual analog scale, which I know that Stuart Ross is particularly into at the moment and he's getting a lot of his students to use, then I have a scoring key, which is essentially a piece of acetate you can put over your questionnaire that will have the lines and the marks on that will tell you how much a line is worth, so you can measure it that way. Which will save you oodles of time. Okay, the next thing that I want to tell you about is Cortex. Now, Cortex is an online survey tool, questionnaire tool, that I can set you up with an account for. And students generally like it because it saves on printing costs. You can download the results straight to SPSS, so you don't have to spend time going, they scored a 2 on that question, add to the 4 they scored on that question. It does it all for you. And that is obviously a big time saver. It can also be more confidential. So if you're asking people kind of confidential questions or very personal questions, often they'll feel more comfortable putting it into a computer where you can assure them that it randomises their answer and everything, as opposed to filling it in a paper and you'll be able to see their response. Okay, so it takes about 30 minutes to set one up if you've got it in kind of a questionnaire in electronic format. So the types of questions you can do with Cortex are as follows. You can use Likert scales, you can do visual analog scales. So Likert scales are the, do you strongly disagree with this statement, or do you strongly agree with this statement? And then options in between. You've got visual analog scales, which you can do on Cortex, which just allow you to move a point on the screen to best describe. So you'll have this completely describes me, this does not describe me, and then it will measure automatically the point that the participants moved it to. You can also have open-ended questions, so you could have someone saying, tell me about your experience in knife crime, and then the participant can just type in what they need to type in. You've also got things like rank order questions, which is kind of when purchasing a mobile phone, which factor is most important, which factor is second most important, which factor is third most important to making that decision. You've also got filtering questions, so that tends to be so if you're doing a health behaviours questionnaire, you might say, do you smoke? And if they took yes, then it would come up with another question saying, how many do you smoke a day? So it makes it the questionnaire shorter for people if they don't need to answer a question. You've also got kind of dichotomous questions like yes, no, male, female, are very useful for demographics. and you can also force, with all the questions, you can do what's called validation. So you can ask for a response. So you can say, we notice you didn't fill in this question, right, and it may be that they've just missed it out, and then they can go back to it and fill it back in. Or it may be that they don't want to fill it in, at which point they click no. When it asks, did you mean to fill in this question, they tick no, and they can carry on regardless. Okay. In terms of getting participants when using Qualtrics, Qualtrics will generate an anonymous link for you, which you can then email out to people, and then they can pass on to their friends, and you can post it on websites, forums, post it on an undergraduate psychology forum if you're allowed to, and that can be, you know, a very effective way of getting participants, as well as, you know, if you can use the snowball effect, so, sampling method. So you can say, can you pass this on to any of your friends who might be interested in taking the survey. You can also use something called Survey Mailer, which allows you to send it out to individual people, and it can track which way, which computer you sent it to, and make sure that the link won't work if it's forwarded on. So that way you have more reassurance that the person you've sent the link to is the person filling it in. Personally, I prefer the top option, because I always find that I want as many people to take part in the survey as possible, and it doesn't really matter if I'm not getting that many people, if I'm not getting the exact person filling in, because my surveys are usually quite generic. The other thing you can do is you can get Qualtrics to send a generic QR code, which you can then put on posters. So if you say got permission in your ethics form and from the appropriate person in the department to put up a poster, or you have somewhere where you want to advertise your study, you can have a QR code at the bottom where you can just scan it with a mobile phone and it will load up the survey automatically. And people tend to like that because it's kind of a bit gimmicky, and that can be a nice way of attracting participants. Okay, word of advice. Putting a survey online will not necessarily guarantee you'll get people to fill it in. So you have to do the work, you have to go out there, you have to ask people to take part. Just make sure you post it on lots of places. A good technique that some people have tried is they've tried posting on, there's a Nights Out Facebook group, and people post a link on there, and that seems to generate a lot of interest, because while it isn't strictly Nights Out at Newman, a lot of Newman students frequent that Facebook page, so that can be quite useful. The other thing you might want to consider doing is booking out a cubicle or a library computer, and if you have the cubicle, you can just book them out and then send 4 people in each cubicle, or you can have them try your luck in JU24. But it's important to make sure you're asking people. But don't be afraid of sending me an email and saying, can I book out cubicle 1, 2 and 3, because often you will be able to. Also, consider having some printed out for those students who just don't like using computers. And Qualtrics will automatically allow you to export it back into Word. That's useful. If you want to know more about using Cortex, then please email me, and I can set up tutorials or whatever. My email address is there. Next thing you might want to use is Superlab. So Superlab is obviously used for precise timings. So many of you will have just used it being in your second year. And if you use the data viewer and set it up right, actually analysing your data can be quite quick and painless. You can just copy and paste it into SPSS. Sadly, there isn't the function to automatically export it into SPSS, but you should be okay. The other thing I should mention is, if you want to use Superlab, you'll need to make sure you've got your participants on campus in order to use it, because they'll need access to a machine with it installed on. Any problems, any questions, please send me an email. It's not unusual for me to give students quite a bit of help in setting up their Superlab experiment initially, and then the students actually, are able to go and run it, and it's actually quite a quick experience. Superlab, a lot of Superlab experiments don't take that long, so quite easy to get participants. Next thing we'll want to look at is kind of iWorks, which is the kind of physiological measures of the kind of biopsych. So we've got things like the galvanic skin response, measuring how much you sweat, plethysmograph, measuring your pulse rate, EEG, electrical activity in the brain, and the oscillogram, which is your eye movement, and the gaze tracker, which is where you're actually looking. And we'll go through each one of these in turn. So the plethysmograph measures pulse rate, and it measures basically how much your ventricular veins expand and contract, and from that it can work out what your pulse rate is. Quite a precise measure, doesn't suffer that much interference, but you have to make sure your participants are kept still. But these are all ways of measuring arousal. The next method is the galvanic skin response, which you used in your first year if you did Cognition of the Brain 1. This measures how much you sweat by passing a small electrical current through your skin, and then because when you sweat it changes the current, you can work out how much you've sweated. It works because physiologically speaking, you sweat more when you've got an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is triggered by when you get physiologically aroused. Next thing you might want to consider is the electroencephalograph, or EEG, for obvious reasons. This is a cat we got about a year ago, and it takes a bit of setting up, and you'll need a bit of training, but it's very useful if you want to answer which part of the brain is responsible for which thing, and it can be quite quick and painless, but it's one of those things that you'll have to start thinking sooner rather than later, because you'll need the training on it. But obviously, any questions, I'm here to support you with that. The next thing that we'll consider is gaze tracking and electroencephalograph, or EOG, for obvious reasons. So gaze tracking is quite a modern phenomenon and has really come up. So gaze tracking will be able to show you where you're actually looking on the screen. So at the moment we've got what's known as a heat map, where the points where you look at the most will give you the darkest reading. You can then export it directly into SPSS. And that's the one you'll most probably want to use. This tends to be in use if you want to kind of maybe show them a video of a knife crime or a mugging taking place, and then ask participants what did they remember, and then correlate it with where they were looking. And the other technique is the OEG, which is basically measures the actual physical eye movements and kind of saccades. So that's very important if you want to look at things like schizophrenia or kind of attention tasks like the Mac work clock. But both are available for students to use. A word of advice: this can be tremendously rewarding, using pieces of equipment and make a dissertation much more interesting. But preparation is the key, because it can take longer to set things up than, say, just carrying out a questionnaire. So it's important that you get the most out of it and try and prepare as much as possible, and don't leave it all to the last minute, which is good advice, I think, for anyone doing a dissertation. There is other equipment available as well, so if you send me an email, I'll let you know what other equipments are available. Here are my contact details. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with any questions. Thank you for listening.